My name is Monica Wilkinson Kelly. I'm the archivist at the Edith B. Ford Memorial Library in Oban, New York. This interview is being conducted as part of the Cayuga and Seneca Lakes Agriculture and Craft Beverage Memory Project. Today is October 14, 2020. I am interviewing Walter Gable, who is the Seneca County historian. Good afternoon, Walter.
Good afternoon, Monica.
And so could I just ask you your history, where you're from and where you went to school?
Well, I was born in the Seneca Falls Hospital. I've been a lifelong resident of Seneca County. When I was a year and a half old, the family bought a house on a farm a mile and a half south of Fayette on Route 414. And so I guess I can say I've been a mid-Seneca County resident virtually from then until 1981 when I moved to Seneca Falls. I went through the Romulus school system, kindergarten through grade 12. I went to Syracuse University and got my bachelor's degree there. I taught 2 years at Clarence, and then I came to Seneca Falls and taught for the next 30 years. I worked on and received my master's degree also at Syracuse University. I have been living in Seneca Falls since March of 1981, and so I'm still a strong Seneca Falls and Seneca County person with a big agricultural background because of growing up on a farm, and my father was a commercial beekeeper.
Oh.
He was one of the very largest beekeepers in New York State at that time. And we also, besides cash crops on the farm, we had chickens. We had as many as 2,500 laying hens at a time. And so we did quite a large egg business.
Oh, I had no idea about the beekeeping. I know Charles Baldrige was also a significant.
The Baldrige brothers, yes. They employed relatives of my dad, of the Hicks family, and so on. And so all fits in there very much.
And today I'd like to talk about the first chartered New York State Agricultural College. So to begin with, we probably would start with John Delafield. And could you tell me who he was?
John Delafield was a New York City banker and businessman, amassed his fortune, probably we can safely say. And in 1841, he decided that he was going to retire from that life, and he bought a farm near Rose Hill Manor in the town of Fayette, basically on the shores of Seneca Lake. His farm became known as Oakland's Farm, and he decided that he was going to make it a model farm. He was very much interested in embracing any new farm technology that was being identified at that time. And one of those innovations, of course, is drain tile, which I imagine we're going to be talking about a little bit later as a separate topic. He very soon became the president of the Seneca County Agricultural Society, and in 1846 he was elected president of the New York State Agricultural Society. In 1842, the New York State Agricultural Society had begun to lobby the New York State Legislature to establish a state agricultural college. That was a new idea at that time that other states were also considering. And there were many in New York State, farmers, for example, that thought that this would be a very important thing for New York to be in the leader position on it. However, It wasn't until Delafield became president of the State Agricultural Society that he really led a major push on the part of the State Agricultural Society to charter a state agricultural college for this state. And it really wasn't until April of 1853, 2 years after he became president of the State Agricultural Society, that finally the New York State Legislature chartered a state agricultural college for this state. Now, the assumption was it would be located on Delafield's farm, Oaklands. Plans were progressing that way. Delafield was named the president of the Board of Trustees for this agricultural college. But then on October 22nd of that same year, 1853, Delafield died suddenly. And the whole idea of the agricultural college becoming a reality just languished. But in a couple of years after that, several communities, Sheldrake in Seneca County, as well as a group of people in the Ovid area, said, we want to be the site of this agricultural college. And it was the Ovid group that was successful in getting the state of New York to agree that the first state agricultural college in New York State would actually be opened on property in the area west of the village of Ovid, with some of the farms that were going to be taken over being in Romulus and some in the town of Ovid. And the local support for this agricultural college to be established was really very enthusiastic. A lot of the area farmers bought shares of stock to raise the capital that was needed to build the first building, to buy the farmlands. The state of New York made a loan of several thousands of dollars to help get this agricultural college off the ground. And it was in early December of 1860, specifically December 5th, that the doors were opened and students began to get instruction in the first state agricultural college in New York State. It was called the State Agricultural College at Ovid because what is today the hamlet of Willard at that time was known as Ovid Landing. And so therefore the term Willard wasn't even being used at that point. Later on, we're going to think of we local people are going to think of this state agricultural college as being at Willard. But that's really not the way it was officially known. Now, this college was really quite revolutionary because the curriculum provided for a great deal of in-the-classroom instruction in agricultural sciences, as they will come to be known eventually, and also practical training and experience out working in the fields. That was very revolutionary. But if you want to talk about bad timing, college opens December 5th, 1860. Students are from all over the eastern United States, including Florida and so on. Some were local. Come April 1861, we have the outbreak of the Civil War. The head of the college is immediately called back by the governor of New York State to become a head organizer of the New York State militia, to become fighting forces after Lincoln's call for Union volunteers. Other staff leave to serve in the Civil War. We have students that leave, the student from Florida and so on like that. They go home to fight for the Confederate cause. The trustees, therefore, realized it was impossible to continue right now, so they temporarily closed the college. The temporary closure of the college, however, in effect became permanent. But, as I had indicated, New York State had loaned several $1,000s to the agricultural college to get it started. And when the college defaulted on that loan, the state of New York seized the properties. They were sold at auction and assets. The stockholders, including the local stockholders, they lost their stock shares investments in the property.
Well, I noticed looking through one document, I discovered the shares, the amount of money that the local farmers were contributing was pretty significant, especially given the time period.
Absolutely. I think that's a very good indication of how much the local farmers realized that this agricultural college really had a valuable role to play in enhancing agriculture. This was at a time period when we're really beginning to see the first serious advancements in mechanization of agriculture taking place. It's also at a time when some diseases, such as the fly, as it was commonly called, were beginning to be a problem for the production of crops in this area. And so therefore, embracing this new technology and scientific agriculture would be a way for the farmers to continue to have a future.
Also significant, the farm property was about 686 acres, as well as the four-story building that was constructed.
You know, 640 acres is a square mile, so we're talking a very significant portion of land.
So going back to Delafield, he had a very good relationship with somebody named John Johnston. Can you talk about him?
John Johnston was an immigrant from Scotland who bought a farm also near Rose Hill Manor. As a matter of fact, he is going to marry, John Johnston will marry a daughter of Mr. Swan, who was owning the Rose Hill Manor at that time. Now, John Johnston's farm was called Viewfields, and it was roughly just south of the big Rose Hill Manor. But Delafield's farm was just roughly north of the Rose Hill Manor. So they weren't that far apart at all. And John Johnston's farm had a lot of low-lying fields that if you had a wet spring, that meant that you were going to have major problems with the fields being too wet to grow good crops. And as he was experiencing that, he remembered in his youth and back in Scotland that the farmers had drain tile that they put in their fields under the surface of their field so that it would help to drain off a lot of the excess water more quickly than it would naturally dry off. And so he decided he was going to use that tactic on his farm. He sent back to Scotland and ordered a few drain tile to be shipped to him. Fortunately, they safely arrived, and he then took them to a tile works operated by a Benjamin Whartonby in Waterloo, New York. And he said, you make pottery pots and so on like that. Can't you copy these and make pottery drain tile that I can then put in my field? And Wharton B says, well, this doesn't look that difficult a job. And he did make drain tile. And Johnston basically used a 10-acre plot as his experiment. And he put the drain tile in and he planted his wheat crop. And lo and behold, his harvest yield was at least 10 times what it was previously. But until that happened, the farmers in the area kind of poo-pooed. What are you putting tile in the ground for? Haven't you got a brain, kind of a thing? But when they saw the yield, they were impressed. Now, Mr. Swan of the Rose Hill Farm and Mr. Delafield of his Oaklands Farm, they very quickly began to utilize as much drain tile as they could. And they had the financial resources that John Johnston himself did not have to rather very quickly buy enough tile and get it laid in the fields and greatly produce their yield. It's going to take Mr. Johnston a little longer. He's going to eventually have 72 miles of drain tiles laid in his fields on his 320-acre farm. Now, lots of farmers were doing this. As a matter of fact, Mr. Johnston was speaking around the country, extolling the virtues of using drain tile. And the drain tile demand became very, very great. Wharton B himself was producing 840,000 drain tile in 1849. There were a total of 10 different companies making drain tiles in Waterloo at one point. There was a drain tile factory in Geneva and so on.
I know Yerkes, is that
in the town of Romulus, there was the Yerkes drain tile business as well. And you see, that has the advantage because the Yerkes operation was right on the route of the new Lehigh Valley Railroad line, so that the drain tile being produced there, as well as those in Geneva, and to a lesser extent in Waterloo, they could be easily shipped via railroad to wherever, as the railroad lines were being built.
I know we are really focusing on the wine industry in Seneca County and Schuyler, and everybody talks about drain tiles. All the vineyard owners and have really mentioned how they're different today, but it's still the same concept.
Significantly, there are two comments about that, what you've just said. Mr. Kime, that owns the farm lands that were John Johnston's farm, says that there are still some of the original drain tile operational in those farm fields. I think that's amazing when you think that that's 180 years almost later. As for the wineries, grapes really love a hot and dry kind of environment. So draining the fields of excess moisture in the ground can certainly be an advantage to the wineries.
And you mentioned Johnston's neighbors thought he was a little extreme. But the same could be said of Jethro Wood, who was also, across Cayuga Lake in Cayuga County, who developed the plow that changed America, really, in agriculture.
Right. You know, almost any new idea, the person that comes up with it is apt to be labeled as having made a folly. William Henry Seward, who masterminded the purchase of Alaska. What did Alaska become known as? Seward's icebox, Seward's folly. But it proved out to be a mineral wealth area, and a real bargain for the purchase price. I'm working on octagon houses, and Orr and Squire Fowler, who introduced the modern idea in the 1850s or late 1840s, of octagon houses. They were called Fowler's folly. And so almost any new idea, it's going to be subject to ridicule until they really learn the true value.
And Delafield took a percentage of the drain tiles that Johnston was producing, correct?
Yes, it was Delafield who had the financial resources. He actually ordered a Skaggs patent tile making machine from England and brought it here, and then had that copied so that there could be more sophisticated ways of making tile. Making more in a shorter amount of time obviously helped to cut the cost, making it more profitable for the farmers to utilize their scarce financial resources to put in their fields.
You mentioned earlier there needed to be some clarification about the first chartered New York State Agricultural College in Ovid versus Cornell University.
Yes, it's a common misconception that I will hear occasionally, although not as much anymore, but that the Agricultural College of Cornell University actually began as the State Agricultural College at Ovid or at Willard. And that's not really true. The State Agricultural College at Ovid was a state chartered agricultural college. There was a board of trustees, and Ezra Cornell of Ithaca was one of the trustees of the State Agricultural College at Ovid. During the Civil War, Congress again passed, as it had under the James Buchanan administration, a Moral Land Grant Act. And this time, instead of President Buchanan vetoing the bill, President Lincoln signed the bill and it became law. And the Moral Land Grant Act gave each state, if it wished, the right to have access to some federal lands in the West, such as Wisconsin or Minnesota or Michigan and so on like that, that they could use the revenues from the sale of those lands towards agricultural and mining sciences colleges a college in their state. So in effect, each state could establish a land grant college. Now, many of those state chartered land grant colleges became known as A&Ms. We have Texas A&M, for example, Agriculture and Mining College. Well, Ezra Cornell was using some of his wealth that he had acquired from his telegraph business to establish a university at Cornell. And it had some financial struggles, and he saw an opportunity that he could get the New York State Legislature to choose to designate Cornell University as the land grant agricultural and mining sciences college for the state of New York. And he hired Reverend Amos Brown to lobby the New York State Legislature for that. And this Amos Brown was the same person that the Ovid area people had hired to lobby the state legislature to get the State Agricultural College established at Ovid. Well, anyways, the New York State Legislature did decide that the State Land Grant College for New York State would be located at Cornell University. And Ezra Cornell very, very shrewdly, I think, held off on the sale of those western lands until the land prices went up so extensively that he was able to establish a $5 million trust fund for Cornell University. And that helps to establish a very sound financial future for Cornell University, and the agricultural college is still operational at Cornell. So it's the result of federal legislation that the state of New York legislature took action on with regards to, unlike the state chartered agricultural college at Ovid.
Now that was the first in the state in Ovid, but also the country, from what I understand, correct?
Well, if it had actually been established in 1853 when it was chartered, it may very well have been the first. But with the languishing due to Mr. Delafield's death and the fact that it doesn't open until December of 1860, by that point, other states had opened state-chartered agricultural colleges.
Okay, and you mentioned Amos Brown, who was actually president of the Ovid Academy.
That's right.
And the library has a catalog, laws, I think 1826, 28, and there was a very strong science. It was really a science-based curriculum. And so I think a lot of that was to get children educated and move forward to become scientific farmers. And so what do you know about beyond Amos Brown?
Well, one of the students at the State Agricultural College at Ovid was one of the Eastmans, a very prominent farm family here in Ovid. I also probably have to add that you do have some local farmers that referred to a person that was a graduate of the agricultural college at Cornell, somewhat derisively referred to as an educated farmer, with a very negative connotation in the tone in which that was said. I think that's being a little bit unfair, because the agricultural college was really training people to become professors of agricultural instruction at other colleges. That was has been a primary goal of the agricultural college at Cornell. Now, the first actual dean of the College of Agriculture at Cornell is a very interesting story. His name is Isaac Phillips Roberts, and he was born on a farm just north of East Varick on Cayuga Lake in the town of Varick. Farm family. He sets up a farm in the Midwest, more specifically near LaPorte, Indiana, and in this was 1862, and soon he was asked to become the superintendent of grounds at the Iowa State College, which was just getting established. And he did a remarkable job of transforming what looked like very sad grounds for that college into really a fine appearance, and that it could be productive farmlands. And Ezra Cornell and his co-founder of Cornell University, Andrew Dixon White, they are struggling to get a sound person to be a good dean of this agricultural college. They had tried college-educated people, and they weren't happy at all. They heard of Isaac Phillips Roberts, and they lobbied him, and he agreed he'd in effect come back to his home area. And he was the first dean of the agricultural college. And he instituted a very sound program of providing so many days a week of in-classroom lecture and then out in the field practical experience. Something that sounds very similar to what was being done at the Agricultural College at Ovid. And he established a major reputation, and he authored many books. And I think he really became something pretty darn good for a person who never went to college himself as a student. His birthplace farm area is designated with a historic marker along Route 89, just north of Varick. His autobiography of a farm boy is a very commonly read book. I have used it in writing to give insight into how farmers were actually doing work in mid-Seneca County at that time period. He had a lot of very practical advice books for farmers to use.
Well, it amazes me when I'm looking through the catalog that we have for the first chartered college. They really had such a scientific understanding. They're talking about Genesee slate and soil content and all these things that were so far really in advance.
And something that I hadn't mentioned, if you'll allow me to add that, John Delafield in 1850 completed and published a very extensive survey on Seneca County. The nature of the geology, the nature of the farms, the statistical data that he compiled for that report is something I use very much to give an idea of what is happening to farm productivity and so on. And so that detailed information is another example of how, what I alluded to earlier, that this is a time when farmers are embracing scientific agriculture because it's needed to continue to be prosperous farmers.
Right, I think it's 1850. I think the map of Delafield had commissioned somebody to do.
Yes, it's commonly called the Delafield map or the Gibson map because it was Gibson that did a public publishing of it. I said that the Civil War had the negative effect of forcing the closure temporarily, and it became permanent, of the State Agricultural College at Ovid. But farmers in Seneca County enjoyed a tremendous profit from their agricultural production that they could sell during the Civil War. Wheat prices went up 150%. Instead of about $1 a bushel, wheat is selling at $2.50 a bushel, and farmers were being encouraged to plant every conceivable acre that they possibly could into food crops so that the soldiers would have food as well as the population at home. And the farmer prosperity was just huge. And many of those farmers, after the Civil War ends, are going to, yes, endure economic hardship as post-war recession sets in, but they're going to have accumulated a lot of money. And if you drive from Seneca Falls to Fayette on 414, you'll see a lot of houses that were built by farmers who made those huge profits during the Civil War years. The most elaborate of which is just off 414, and it's the Henry Hoster House. And it allegedly cost $40,000 for the house and its furnishings. That's a huge sum of money for those times.
Right. Well, you certainly are proud of your Seneca County heritage and your family history and agriculture. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
Well, I have to say, in response to one thing you just said there's that wonderful scene in the Gone with the Wind movie. This is very emotional for me, in which Scarlett O'Hara reaches down and holds up dirt from Tara Farm in her hand. Being on a farm, being raised on a farm, I think you have a love for land and what goes into it in a way that urban population can probably never fully comprehend.
A very strong connection, very emotional connection. I
Yes.
can see. Yeah, no, I had no idea that your family had that background, and so it's wonderful that you were able to share that with us today. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about? We've covered so many things.
Agriculture is still the number one industry in Seneca County. I believe it's still the number one industry in New York State. Despite all of the in business and industry that you think of in New York State, agriculture is still so vitally important. And we have lots of new challenges. Technology has certainly transformed us from a lot of small-scale farms into these humongous commercial farms. Hedgerows have been cleared as a result. That maybe helps to explain a lot of the decline in wildlife in this county. Pheasant hunting today is not what I can remember when I was a young adult. All of those kinds of things. But change is a reality, and
Thousands of acres were lost when the Seneca Army Ordnance Depot was created, and the Sampson Naval Training Station as well.
yes, lots of farms and fruit orchards, warehouses were lost in that. Interestingly, a large portion of the former depot is being returned to Amish farmlands and so on. My folks actually sold their farm in winter of 19, now let's see here, winter of 1980 to an Amish, one of the early Amish settlers in mid-Seneca County, because his oldest son was going to need a farm of his own. And so it has remained in that family. David Stolfus no longer actually farms it. He's turned it over to two of his sons, but he continues to live there in the farmhouse.
Well, that's great. Well, I appreciate your time. And again, this is Walter Gable. We didn't talk about how you became a Seneca County historian, but there's so much to talk about. Maybe we should do it in segments, a continuing weekly story. But today is October 14, 2020, and I appreciate you sharing your knowledge, your wealth of knowledge, your experience of 32 years of teaching, and your
17 years as county historian now.
County historian. So thank you so much for your time.